Okay, looks like we are live. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our webinar this morning. My name is Anita Lucchese, and I'm Executive Director of Sovereign Bodies Institute. And today I'm here to have a conversation with Dr. Desi Rodriguez-Lombert. Desi is one of our founding board members and also is one of the leading scholars on Indigenous data sovereignty. And she's been an invaluable addition to our board as someone who has critical expertise on how to care for our data in the best way possible. And I'll let Desi introduce herself, so I'll just share a little bit about her. Desi is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. She just graduated with her PhD in sociology from the University of Arizona, and she is a new faculty member at UCLA. She's joining us from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, and is going to speak with us today on Indigenous data sovereignty, what that means when we think about data on missing and murdered Indigenous people, and how we can use and mobilize that data to better protect our people. So with that, I'm going to invite Desi to join us. Yay, hello, thank you for joining us. Desi, do you want to start by just introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about you and your work?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, Pive Chef, everybody. Good day. My name is Desi Rodriguez-Lombert. Mukshiatna Shive. My Cheyenne name is Bear Mint Woman. The translation is Mukshihat. I'm a social demographer, so I've got graduate training in both sociology and demography, and the work that I do is really focused on Indigenous population statistics, really looking at how we empower Indigenous communities and especially our Native nations with data by us, for us to drive sovereignty. And so I'm currently an assistant professor at UCLA in the sociology department, and I also have a teaching line in the American Indian Studies program at UCLA. I've just founded the Data Warriors Lab, which is an Indigenous social science laboratory where we work in partnership with scholars, students, and tribal partners to think about how to build stronger data systems for Indigenous futures. And so we've got some projects right now that are focused on COVID. We've got some projects looking at, of course, MMIW, as well as projects around the 2020 census. So it's a really important time right now in Indian country. It's a really difficult time. Everybody is really struggling, but we have some very, very critical data issues that, that we need to be talking about, in addition to how do we keep our community safe? How can data support those efforts? I'm based here in my community in Lame Deer on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. We have the third highest infection rate of COVID in the country. We have the highest rate in Montana. We have lost, I think, almost 10 of our tribal members now. And so we're in a really critical time here. And we're facing an immense data crisis around COVID. And a lot of it has to do with systems not talking to one another, this kind of breakdown in networking around data at the federal, state, county, and tribal levels. And that same kind of incongruence, we see that with the MMIP data as well. And so the work that we, Sovereign Bodies has been doing on MMIP in southeastern Montana, we've got some best practices that we have learned from that project. There's a lot of barriers and obstacles that we've also become very familiar with, and we're seeing that bleed over into other areas like COVID data right now. So I'm really happy to be here and to discuss more around Indigenous data sovereignty, how it intersects with the MMIP movement. I co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network with my colleague Stephanie Carroll at the University of Arizona. And so that is a network that is still, it's still going, it's very strong. We've got people all across the United States who are engaged in Indigenous data sovereignty and governance work in different fields and different sectors, in tribal communities and urban communities at different universities. And so that US-based network is also part of a global Indigenous Data Alliance network, where we've got folks in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Australia, in Basque Country, in Spain, folks down in Mexico and Canada. So we have a very large global movement of data warriors who are committed to the aims of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. And of course, I'm also incredibly privileged and honored to support the work of Sovereign Bodies Institute as a founding board member, and to really help to shape and influence how SBI engages with MMIP data, and how we partner with different entities, including scholars and of course, communities and nations. So that's just a little bit about the work that I do, and what kind of drives my my data world. So happy to be here. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you for joining us. We're lucky to have you here. Our first question is just for anybody who's new to this kind of topic, can you explain what exactly Indigenous data sovereignty is?
Sure. So Indigenous data sovereignty emerges out of a rights-based framework. So if we think about the rights of tribal nations and where sovereignty comes from, it comes out of this inherent right of a tribal nation to govern itself, to govern its resources, its peoples, its lands. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of a tribal nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. It comes out of this inherent right to govern that tribal nations have, and it's essentially the exercise of tribal sovereignty over tribal data. And so that includes data on tribal citizens, wherever they may be, not just on tribal lands. It includes the exercise of sovereignty over data on anybody living on tribal lands, whether they're native or non-native. It includes the exercise of sovereignty over data on our lands, on our resources. And so it's a very broad definition of what Indigenous data sovereignty is, and it's purposefully and intentionally broad to encompass all that that is Indigenous data and all that is the sovereignty of nations, Native nations.
And why is that so important? What's the lasting impact of Indigenous data sovereignty?
So, about 5 years ago now, I started talking to tribal leaders in the United States about data and sovereignty. And this came out of the work that I had done. I was a tribal researcher in Aotearoa, New Zealand for many years before coming back to the United States and working with tribes here. And I had learned about the strength and the power in data by our tribal communities for our tribal communities, and developed that set of skills and that kind of passion over in New Zealand. But when I came back to the US and started doing this work here, one of the first projects that I did was a series of interviews with our tribal leaders here in the US. And I was wanting to really understand, how do tribal leaders conceptualize the connection between data and sovereignty, and is there a connection? How deep is that connection, and what does it look like? And one of the tribal leaders that I interviewed shared with me a quote, a statement that has really permeated all aspects of the work that I do. And he said, well, when I think about data and I think about sovereignty, I think about how sovereignty is sacred. Sovereignty was given to us by the Creator. And so because of that, it is sacred. And so data to exercise our sovereignty is also sacred. And so I'm thinking about how the sovereignty of Native nations is sacred. It's something that cannot be taken away. It is literally given to nations by the creator within an indigenous worldview. And if we think about how vital data are to the exercise of sovereignty, then that sacredness also comes to capture the data that we use to govern our nations. And so to me, that shifted the way I think about data and information and knowledge. And when we have an indigenous worldview, when we consider data through that worldview, I think we can transform how we as data analysts and scholars and activists treat data and use data to help our people, because ultimately that's what we're doing, right? We want to help our people. We want to leave this world a little bit better than how we found it, and data is so vital to that. And so I think that is kind of one of the core tenets of how I consider data a part of tribal sovereignty. A part of this movement is through its sacredness, and then when we treat data as sacred, data is imbued with a real deep sense of power to create change. And I think we're seeing that in the MMIP movement, especially.
Yeah, can you speak to that a bit more? One of the things we wanted to ask you is, I know that there's been all sorts of efforts to gather data on MMIP, whether it's through SBI or other grassroots organizations and groups. And I think everybody knows that data on this issue is important, but we don't always talk about what we do with the data afterwards. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us some of your thoughts on what it actually means to mobilize data to better protect or bring home our missing and murdered loved ones.
Sure. So, Indigenous data sovereignty is about Indigenous rights. And so if we think back to before our lands were invaded, tribal nations exercised sovereignty over every aspect of their societies. This included data and information. And so our peoples have always been data experts. And, oh, excuse me. I hope that didn't, am I still on?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Our people have always been data experts. And as a result of this colonial invasion and these kind of incremental encroachment on tribal sovereignty, we've been stripped of these ways that we used to take care of one another, these ways that we used to protect one another. And data and information were critical to that. And so now our tribal nations have been really are in different states of this kind of data dependency. That's what we've termed it. And by data dependency, we mean relying on other entities, other sovereigns, local, state, county, federal governments for data on our people. And that's wrong. We can't keep doing that. And, we see that so acutely in the MMIP movement, that reliance on data collected by others to try to inform, this movement has not gotten us to where we need to be. And this is where we have the crisis that we're in now, right? And so the response to that, with individuals like yourself and SBI and other scholars and community members, has been to think, how do we start collecting these data by us, for us? How do we depart from this dependency model? How do we start reclaiming sovereignty over these data? And as tribal citizens, as community members, and as, of course, as tribal nations, most importantly, those steps are being made. And so the data that is being collected now, there are so many different ways that it's happening. So, we have families who are providing that information voluntarily because they are so desperate for any sort of traction, towards justice for their family members. We've got partnerships, with certain agencies now where we're getting data, we're seeing traction there. Unfortunately, we know that a lot of the data that we are getting on MMIP is coming from Freedom of Information Act requests, actually having to engage in this federal watchdog system because the data aren't being provided voluntarily by these agencies that are supposed to serve and protect. And then ultimately, you know, I think where this needs to go, you know, where Indigenous data sovereignty really demands attention in this matter is that tribal nations need to be doing this work. And I know it's hard. And I know that there are so many, you know, acute crises that our tribal leaders and our tribal nations face daily. And data may seem like the bottom of the pile. And I've been there. I've advocated in tribal council chambers to tribal leaders about how their focus needs to be on data, in addition to, of course, the gamut of other crises that they are facing. And it's hard sometimes to communicate why. And why, you know, if we have elders who have no heat in the middle of winter and it's 30 below, why should I invest money in data collection right now when that is the more pressing concern? And my response is always, I go back to that tribal leader who told me data are sacred, and that data to exercise our sovereignty are sacred. And so we have to think about how data and information can improve our ability to lead, can improve our ability to help our people, and see data not as an obligation or as a burden, but as an opportunity, and as a responsibility. And so I really see moving forward the potential for tribal nations to come together, to band together, to, you know, exercise their sovereignty over data on their missing relatives, you know, and start demanding from these other entities, you know, a direct linkage of data, you know, that is actually meaningful. So why don't we have data systems that are talking to one another? Why are there no direct linkages between tribal data, for example, tribal enrollment data, and data at the state, county, and federal level on missing persons, on you know, with our justice statistics, with our mortality data? I think the real future is to get tribes to exercise sovereignty. I think their most powerful way to do that would be in partnership with one another, and creating almost kind of these kind of regional data hubs, data centers, wherein they then engage in data linkage with other entities who are collecting these data on our people all the time. And so without that kind of formal kind of linkage and systems talking to one another, we're going to have to keep doing what we're doing. And it's not, I'm not saying that what we're doing is bad. You know, it's just, it's hard, and we're operating in silos, and we're, you know, we've got different databases operating in different places. We have, you know, different scholars working on different things, different agencies and community members. And there really needs to be a centralized system that tribes and communities can tap into, and that folks like you, Anita, and myself, and other, you know, data analysts and advocates and scholars we're the worker bees in this work, right? We're the ones that, you know, who, we don't have the authority, we don't have any sort of sovereign power, but we're the worker bees who continue to try to advocate and crunch the numbers and get the data. And so we're a critical piece in this. And so I really hope moving forward that those systems can converge, and that there can be some sort of way forward that brings that all together.
Absolutely. Those are so many good points. I think one of the things that I really like to remind folks is that tribes are sometimes sitting on data they don't even realize they have. And in the context of MMIP, the example that I give is enrollment offices have death certificates for their citizens. And it would be a lot of work, especially if it's all, you know, paper files, but it is possible for someone to go through those files, pull the death certificates, and at least get a sense of how many folks were murdered or experienced some kind of suspicious death. So sometimes it's not just fighting for existing data that's hard to access, but it's being creative about the data that we already have, and putting in the work to make sure that we're using it to its full potential. And I think the point about linkages is really important too. We we worked, our office is based here in California, and we work with families all over. But one of the interesting things about being in California is it has such huge intertribal communities, with folks from all over Indian country. And so, especially in urban areas like San Francisco or LA, there's so many people that come from all over. And unfortunately, the issue of missing and murdered can impact them here. So we worked on a murder case last year of a woman who was from a tribe in Montana who was killed in Southern California. And of course, there's no notification system. Like the medical examiner in Southern California has no relationship with this woman's tribe, and no pre-existing way or channel of communication. And it was really challenging for that family to try to work across such a huge geographic expanse and across state jurisdictions to try to advocate for their loved one. So building those kind of regional linkages, I think is so important, not just on individual cases like that, but it also becomes a way of practicing our diplomacy between tribal nations or between Indigenous communities. I mean, imagine how powerful it would be to be able to tell a tribe, we know that your citizen was murdered in our territory, and we want you to know about this, and we want you to know that we're on it. Imagine how powerful that would be if tribes entered in those kinds of relationships or partnerships. So I think there's a lot of fruitful ground there. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, Desi, is I know that a lot of tribes may be really interested in this kind of work, but might be feeling some kind of paralysis about how to get started. Do you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we can talk about the importance of this and how, there are opportunities, but I think some of the most critical barriers that we need to be talking about as well, and kind of obstacles to engaging in this type of work, is the fact that we just also lack people power. There are so few of our people, of our Native people, who are trained in how to do this work. And you don't need a PhD. You surely don't. I mean, our young people, for example, who are incredibly tech savvy, who grew up in this kind of tech world, data world, are so such critical, I think, kind of missing links in this work. And so I really see an opportunity in our tribal colleges and universities that are in our communities, our TCUs, to really think about what does it mean to do data for tribal communities, by tribal communities? What does Indigenous data science look like? How do we start thinking about training programs that are actually building this workforce? And we're not doing that right now. And so this is where the Data Warriors Lab, this is one of the kind of critical areas where I see the Data Warriors Lab filling a really big need, is training and actually really partnering with tribal communities, especially with our tribal colleges and universities, to bring data training into communities where it's so needed, and to actually build that in a sustainable way. We can't be, we continue to try to get our young people to leave and go to college and get training and come home, but that model has not worked. It really has not worked in our tribal communities. And I'll be the first one to say that, very few in my community have left and come home. I'm one of the few who keeps trying to come home and keeps trying to help and keeps trying to engage, because it's very, very difficult. There are so many opportunities beyond the reservation and beyond our communities where our young people are valued and respected and honored. And we don't do a very good job of that in our communities. And so I think we have to shift the kind of paradigm. And it needs to be one where I think we got to come back. We have to bring, training into our communities and try to build something sustainable. And that data warrior workforce is what is, I think, a pivotal missing link in this work. So where do tribes start? Start by trusting your own people. There are people who work in your communities, who are tribal employees, who are doing good work. Oftentimes they're in your enrollment departments. I think about my own community and my own tribe, and you know, the tribal program, who I have such utmost respect for and who continue to support the work that I do in small ways and in big ways, is our enrollment department. They are our data hub. And I know that this isn't the case for all tribal communities, but you know, there are good people who are working in these areas, and maybe it's your forestry department, maybe it's your public health department, maybe it's, you know, your TIPO offices. You know, there are people who are in these positions, and maybe it's not directly related to, you know, to MMIP, you know, of course, but the data skills that are there can be, you know, shared across you know, kind of subject area. And so that, to me, is, I think, a really important thing that tribes and communities can start doing, is identify your data warriors. Where are they? I guarantee you have at least one. And think about how to continue to empower them and value them, and figure out how you can build up and scale up from what they know. And it's a really call, I think it's a call to action for those of us who are who have these skills, who are in positions where we can find grant money, bring in partnerships, and actually almost like go on the road and start taking this knowledge and bringing it back into our communities. You know, we have to shift that model of send us your young people and let's train them at these, you know, primarily white institutions where they're not valued, where they're going to have to struggle, where they're going to endure all of these, you know, really awful things, because we've endured them. We know what it's like to be in these systems of higher education, where we are not valued and where we are continuing to have to struggle to just be visible, much less thrive. And so I think reversing that paradigm and bringing that knowledge and that training back into our communities is what we're going to have to do.
Are there any training resources that you would recommend folks check out?
Yeah, so I think, you know, right now there, you know, because we're in such difficult times with COVID, so much has been put on hold because we actually can't do that face-to-face work. We can't actually go into communities. We can't, you know, right now we're having to think outside the box and having to think through virtual trainings and how do we start doing this in a way that, you know, I think this is going to be our new normal for a while. And so I think, you know, there continues to be a lot of requests for kind of data training. And so I know, for example, at the University of Arizona, through the Native Nations Institute, we offer an Indigenous data sovereignty kind of short course. And that again, though, required people to come to us, right? You needed to come to Arizona for this week-long course and take this class. And so I think there's a massive shift happening in how we as scholars and as kind of data advocates are conceptualizing the delivery of this information. And so the way I see it is, this knowledge is not mine. You know, these skills that I have built are not mine. They are for the people. And if I can't share that with our people and our communities and pass that information on in ways that are sustainable, that continue to grow this force of data warriors, then what's the point? All of this education that I've earned, that I've fought for, is pretty meaningless. And I think that there are scholars out there who also believe that. And so in these COVID times, we're having to kind of adjust and pivot a bit. So I guess I would just say to kind of watch this space. I think there's going to be an increasing number of virtual trainings and kind of ways to partner and to kind of get these data skills into our communities. And I would really urge you know, individuals, if you are interested, you know, in getting, you know, further training in basic kind of data analyses, or even just how to access data on your community. You know, there are lots of data sources out there, publicly available data sources, that, you know, with information on our tribal peoples, on our communities, not just in tribal communities, on reservations, but also in urban areas. And so there are lots of data sources out there. And I think the key is, how do we get people to understand how to access those data sources, and what form will those data be in, and what can we do with them, and how do we start using them to inform our work. And so using those existing data that are out there, and then once you start using the existing data, you start realizing where the gaps are. You start realizing, well, we don't have information or data on this, or this. So now we have to start building those data. And so I really see it as this kind of two-pronged approach. Let's use what's out there, because there's a lot of data on Native people. We are heavily surveilled. There is so much data being collected on us all the time. And a lot of that is being collected through grants. I mean, so many of our tribal nations depend on federal grants for the delivery of basic services. And unfortunately, as any tribal director or any tribal employee will know, the majority of your time as a tribal director and a tribal employee is figuring out how to meet these grant requirements all the time. And that includes, the collection of data and the submission of reports. And so all of those data are held by the federal government. And there are, administrative data on our communities all over the place in all of these different departments. And so I think once we start understanding how to use what's out there, we can then start to figure out how do we plug the gaps and start building what isn't out there as well. And so it's exciting. I think it's daunting, because we also have so many other crises and so many other needs. But I go back to that initial discussion with tribal leaders and trying to really hit home the fact that data are sacred. And then if we have data, we can inform the future of our tribal nations and our communities, and shape those futures in ways that we wouldn't have been able to without that data.
Well, and I think part of the reason that fighting for these data is so important is that they do help us address these crises in the best way possible. I think there's so many crises that have gone on in Indian country for decades that really hardworking folks have worked really hard to address. But unfortunately, they continue because we don't have all of the information to make the best decisions possible on how to address those crises, or on how to think creatively on how to address them. And I think a really great example of data warrior work kind of in that realm to address an ongoing crisis is there's been news articles circulating right now about the Yurok tribe entering a lawsuit to fight for data on Indigenous kids who are in the foster care system. Trump rolled back initiative that Obama put in place to make sure that there was better data being captured on our kids that are in the foster care and child welfare system. And it's really crippled tribes' ability to advocate for their children that do end up in that system. And it's not just Native kids, it's also LGBT kids that are not having data captured on them. And the tribe has entered in to fight for both groups of kids to say, hey, these things should have never been rolled back. This data is absolutely crucial in helping us protect and advocate for our kids. So it's not even necessarily a choice of one or the other, addressing a crisis or gathering data, because in many instances, that data is actually a critical resource to addressing the crisis.
And that brings up a kind of an issue, whereas like as statisticians and, we know that data exists on certain populations for certain reasons. We know that data doesn't exist on certain populations for certain reasons, right? So if we're thinking about the United States Census, for example, and I go back to the census because I'm a demographer and we're in the middle of a census collection right now, and it's going horribly awry. We've got the federal government who has actually, the Trump administration has actually cut the window of collection for the census. They've actually shortened it by 30 days. For what reason? Completely politically driven, to try to prevent people from being counted. And we know which people they don't want counted. They don't want people to be counted. We don't want Native peoples to be counted. They don't want undocumented peoples to be counted. They don't want Black peoples and Latinx peoples and, to be counted. And so when we're thinking about who is in the data, who is actually represented in these data systems, I think the bigger question that we need to be asking, and who is not in these data systems, who is not counted. And when you bring up the importance of young people and our children, and young children have one of the highest undercounts in the census. And if we look at Indian country, we are very young we have very young, we're a very youthful population. So we know that in Indian country, American Indians and Alaska Natives have high rates of fertility. Our kind of age distributions tend to skew down, where we have lots of young people and young kids. And so it's very concerning, how is it that our young people and our kids are being missed? And they're not included in these data systems, and not just in these kind of, systems that are supposed to be collecting data on vulnerable kids, our foster care system, our guardian ad litem systems where there's supposed to be legal representation for young people, who are caught up in different sorts of court issues. But just across the board, we're seeing such undercounting, and it really should be a red flag for anybody working in Indian country. If we're not counting our young kids and they're falling through the cracks in all of these systems, then how do we address that? And I think there's such value in partnering. And I know that tribalism is alive and well, and I know that we operate from this, often from this kind of model of scarcity, this kind of scarcity, this place of scarcity, and it's an intentional space that our Indigenous communities have been forced into as a result of this kind of ongoing experience with colonialism, and so we're fighting over these scraps, and it really inhibits any sort of goodwill towards partnering and towards coming together and to shifting our mindset from scarcity to abundance. But we really need to have that shift, especially when it comes to data, because there is so much that can be done in terms of partnering and doing these data linkages and having the advocacy that needs to be all the way up to the federal levels. There's only so much that scholars and advocates can do because we don't have that sovereign authority that tribal leaders have. And so, we rely so heavily on our tribal leaders to do that type of advocacy at the federal level, and just think about how valuable that could be and how much stronger it could be if it was done in partnership with each other. And so, I guess I wanted to just point to that because you brought up kids and how our kids are falling through the cracks in all of these different data systems. And it's definitely super concerning.
Yeah, well, and especially our kids in the foster care system, one of the things that was shocking to me when I found out was that when a foster kid goes missing or runs away, it's actually confidential. Like the social workers that work with them are not allowed to make that public information. So it's not just that nobody bothers, it's that the system actually bars them from sharing that information. And that child is at such a high level of risk for all sorts of violence, and no one's even allowed to know that they need help, which to me is just terrible.
This gets back to the need for systems transformation, and why is it that, for example, this young person who has run away and is now missing, why isn't that a public health crisis? Why is that only a crisis where justice officials are getting involved, right? And so I go back to the public health crisis because tribes are public health authorities. So just like any other county, state, local, federal agency, tribes are public health authorities. And so they can demand and are obligated to receive privacy, protected data on individuals. And so we get back to the fact that, for example, this COVID pandemic that's hitting Indian country right now, one of the biggest issues is that you've got data being collected by, the Fed, CDC. You have data being collected by county and states around, who's testing positive, mortality, who's, been hospitalized, who's in critical state, all of these different metrics that are tracking how the pandemic is playing out in different communities. And tribes are entitled to all of those data on their citizens, on individuals living within their boundaries, in addition to just all of their citizens wherever they may be at. Mm-hmm. And so I want to bring home the importance of advocating for data as public health authorities at the tribal level, and figuring out how can we start shifting kind of how we talk about delinquency, how we talk about this kind of overly criminalized state in which we live in as Indigenous peoples. How do we shift how we talk about that to public health crises, to thinking about wellness and about outcomes in such a way that are related to our overall well-being as communities, because not only is there a policy hook there, but that's how an Indigenous worldview works. We don't think about, the criminals in our communities. They're not just offenders. They're our relatives, right? There are our brothers and our uncles and our aunties and our mothers. Same way with our young people who are running away. What are they running away from? They're not just deviants. There's something going on there wherein they're not safe, wherein they're not being taken care of and protected. And that's a health crisis. And so I'm hoping that that this COVID pandemic can kind of serve as this catalyst for shifting the way that we are thinking about how Indigenous peoples are pathologized. And that can also serve a very important policy hook, so that the data can be provided to tribes as public health authorities.
Absolutely. One of the questions I have for you is, I think you know well, and there's been a lot of national discussion on this and just how challenging it is to gather MMIP data, especially as you've mentioned, like tribes have a right to data on their citizens wherever they may be, whether it's on or off the Reservation. But gathering data about things that happen off the Reservation is extremely challenging, even in neighboring jurisdictions. This webinar is part of a series of events raising awareness for Justice For Kaysera Stops Pretty Places. Kaysera was murdered in Hardin last year, and I think one of the things that gets lost in the discussion about Kaysera's case is that it was not tribal jurisdiction. It was very close to tribal jurisdiction, but her case was county sheriff jurisdiction because it happened off of tribal land. And yet the family has had a horrible time trying to access basic information about Kaysera's case from both the county attorney and the county sheriff. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice for either families or for tribal nations advocating on behalf of the families in their community as they try to work with these local level county or state agencies trying to gather this data.
Yeah, I'm very aware of Kaysera's case, and I know that the circumstances surrounding how Kaysera's case has been essentially mishandled by the county and the state is not unique. It's not an exception. It's actually more than likely the rule of how things happen for MMIP cases, especially in border town communities. And so one of the things that, if we're thinking about solutions, because we need to be thinking about solutions, we can get bogged down in the barriers and the obstacles, and every day we can continue to focus on that, and sometimes we have to. I think we're human, but I think the greater call for us is to think about how do we build solutions, and one of the solutions that I think that I think could be something I guess that could be part of the solution is, where would that information go? So for example, like if we continue to have, there are demand letters, to the coroner, and demand letters to the county sheriff, and demand letters can be issued to, the crimes lab, that demanding that information be sent to whom? And so it's that who is on the receiving end of this information? Sure, the families, sure, it's, attorneys that are working on behalf of families, but where I see a tremendous opportunity, where I think Indigenous data sovereignty can be leveraged, is at the tribal level. If tribes could establish, tribal data centers, tribal data departments, a place where, the data that is demanded, legally through different legal actions, can then be transferred to some other sovereign entity, where then there could be, opportunity to kind of work on not just one case, but multiple cases. We know that, especially here in southeastern Montana, there are so many unsolved deaths for our missing and murdered Indigenous people, in the Crow Nation, on the Northern Cheyenne, Nation, but across Montana. And every single Native nation is experiencing this exact same crisis. And so I think there needs to be the leveraging of sovereignty at the tribal level, to actually be the recipient of those data. And that, I think that would also provide, I think, a bigger impetus for other sovereigns, so counties, states, feds, to engage on that nation to nation level. They're not just working with the community organization. They're not just working with, an attorney on behalf of a family. Like, this is the real deal. This is nation to nation. This is sovereignty. This is in the US Constitution. You will do this. And so building that level of capacity, I think, is really, really important. And I think that it could happen, for example, I know here on Northern Cheyenne, we're actively trying to get a tribal data center established. The hope is that we can get that established, and serve as, kind of a model for other nations, tribal nations, to develop. I think, we look at Canada, for example, there are regional First Nations data centers in Canada, where First Nations have come together and supported the establishment of these regional centers to serve as those data hubs. But I think that is one part of the solution. I think the other part is that there just needs to continue to be ongoing attention and advocacy. And it's exhausting. I know it's exhausting. I know families are exhausted by having to continue to advocate and continue to seek justice. And, it shouldn't be this hard. It should not be this hard. But we know it is this hard because we live it every day. And I think there are opportunities to really start thinking about how to improve systems, and systems kind of thinking, I think, can kind of start helping to alleviate the burden that is placed on families, on community organizations, to continue to lift tremendously heavy weights, to keep this work going. And that because of the tremendous weight that you lift all the time with SBI. We have to have systems thinking around this, and systems networking, and this massive shift. And I think tribes, by leveraging sovereignty, can be the foundation of it.
I think one of the things that I wanted to really hit on in this webinar is access to SBI's data. And I know that Desi has talked a lot about tribes having a right to data on their citizens. That's something we firmly believe in at SBI and that we put into practice every day. So if there's any folks from tribal nations, tribal governments listening, we do provide data to tribes. So for example, there's a tribe that requests they get monthly reports from us. So on the first of the month, every month, they get a report in their email inbox. And it has all the data, not just on their citizens, but actually on every case that's ongoing in their state, as well as any case that this particular tribe is in California. So they get all of the data on California, as well as all of the data on California Native people wherever they may have been. So if there was, someone who's Yurok who went missing in Texas, they're still going to get that information. And they get that updated every month. They don't have to keep asking for it. It's just on our list of things to do on the first of the month. And so we really believe in making that available to tribes in that way, and encourage tribes to reach out to us so that we can set up that relationship. I'm really excited. SBI is in the process of actually shifting our database into a whole new system that's going to make that process a lot simpler in terms of kicking out those reports. And it can be monthly, it could be once a week, it could be every 6 months. The timing is up to you as you sign up for that. But that's going to be, I think, hopefully really helpful for us as an organization, but also in mobilizing the data and getting it into the hands of the people who need it to do good work to protect our people.
Awesome.
I wanted to close this discussion just by sharing a bit more about SBI's data and how to access it, as well as some important information on the Justice for Kaysera campaign. So I'm actually going to share my screen so that folks can see our website and know exactly how to find the information. So we're here on SBI's homepage on our website. And what you're going to do is there's a tab called MMIW G2 database. If you go to the drop-down menu and click request, it will take you to a page that has information on how to email us to ask for data. So it's important to tell us what kind of data you need, who you are, and how you plan to use it, as well as your timeline for your project. We do recommend that you make a request in advance. Like, don't be asking for something for an event the next day. Please reach out to us a week or two in advance at the latest. And it has information on how to email us to send in that request. We also have something new on our website that I'm hoping will be helpful for folks. It's our data sharing protocols, and you can click this box and it will actually take you to the document. And these protocols were developed by SBI's board in partnership or in consultation with me and with other folks who have worked with MMIW families on what the appropriate protocols should be. But Desi, I wanted to invite you as a board member to speak to some of these protocols and the decisions that we made in terms of who has access to what.
Sure. So I think it's become really important. SBI, there's over 4,000 individuals who are now in the MMIP database, because it also includes our two-spirit relatives. But we, as a board, we instituted a kind of a tiered access policy. And so we have category 1, which is essentially the most open policy, wherein we have identified tribal leaders and tribal nations, as well as service providers. So if you are a Native service provider, and we've identified that as being, shelters, domestic violence, initiatives, child services, healthcare. If you are providing direct services to individuals who are Native and you need these data to support those efforts, we want to make these data available to you. Similarly, we, at SBI, we absolutely honor and respect the sovereignty of our Native nations, and so they are up there as well in that category 1. And that is just a simple signing the data share, just sign the agreement about data sharing, that we are providing these data to you, and for the purposes that you have, outlined. And like Anita said, it can even be that we're providing these data to you regularly. It might not just be a one-off request. It could be something that is ongoing. And I think we really want to encourage the development of those long-term partnerships. And so that's category 1. And then we go into category 2, wherein we talk about, okay, we want to provide data that is relevant to the service area or to the kind of topic and the issue area that that different organizations are dealing with. So this includes Indigenous women's collectives at the community level, advocacy organizations, grassroots activists. These are all individuals and entities that are working on the ground in our communities for whom these data can continue to support their work. They're not tribal organizations, so they're not affiliated necessarily with individual tribes. These are grassroots collectives and organizations. And so again, that request is a little bit more detailed. We want to know the service area or kind of the issue area that, so that we can ensure that the data are relevant. And there again is a data sharing agreement that has to be signed. And then we move into category 3, which is kind of a lot more protected. And so these are entities that we will not give you raw data, but you can obtain aggregate data, which are basically kind of high level data that have been coded in such a way that the data are de-identified, really. So this is to protect the privacy of the individuals who are in the database, and that's on request as well. And that includes law enforcement, the press and media, as well as kind of colonial agencies, so the feds, state, county, local. And we've also made a very open statement about the fact that we want to protect these data in such a way that it is we don't want to give these data to individuals or agencies or entities that could use it for harm, that could use it to continue to surveil or continue to negatively impact our peoples. And so that's a part of our kind of call to stewardship. And so that goes to category 3. And I think, ultimately too, we're seeing that there's a lot of increased demand by academics. And so there's a whole separate request for academics and research purposes. We have a separate kind of section here that Anita is showing you. We need to have, an IRB, an ethics board approval to see that your academic institution, that you are covered under their ethics protocol, that you've met their requests and their demands. And then, all of those requests will go to the board. We have PhD, individuals on the board who are very familiar with academic research requests. And we're very protective of that because these are data that are about our people, our loved ones that demand a heightened level of protection. And so it goes to the board for review. That's not to say that we will not grant access, but it does mean that there is a heightened level of scrutiny and review that goes into these requests. Especially if you are a non-Indigenous academic. That is something that is an immediate red flag for us. What do you want these data for? Who are you partnering with? Who are you, accountable to? Which communities in this work? That's very, very important that we question that and your motives. And as academics, we should be ready and able to defend that and answer those questions at any point. And I say that for myself as well as an academic. And so that's kind of just, I think it's really important that there is a public document that individuals can go to and look at and see how there is data access being granted. These are not data that we are hoarding, that we want to keep to ourselves. We want these data to be used for good. But as part of that, we do know that data can be used for harm, and it is our responsibility to do everything we can to mitigate that harm. So thanks, Anita, for giving me that opportunity. We've really been very intentional and careful about how we think through access in a way that is continuing to advance the work, but also protecting the data that we do have. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Desi. Yeah, I think it's really important just to note that all of these protocols are in place to not only protect the data, but to protect the families that are represented in the data. So one of the things that you'll see when you look at our data sharing protocols is that we don't allow anyone to use the data if it's going to be involved in selling items for profit. We don't think that folks should be profiting off of this issue. And we also don't allow folks to publicly publish raw data. So lots of people want to, make posters or signs or whatever, or sometimes even t-shirts with all the names from the database. And we don't do that. And the reason that we don't is because not every family is there yet. This issue is, if you have lived experience of having lost someone in your family, it's such deep grief and trauma that we have to be really loving and careful and compassionate and kind to families who've been impacted. And part of that means that we respect that not everyone is ready to be public about their loved one's case. Not everyone wants the general public to be talking about their loved one's case or advocating for their loved one. Not everyone is able to have the conversation. And we've seen that the hard way with families who are not ready for that yet. And unfortunately, someone from the community speaks on their loved one's case without permission or without talking to the family. And it can cause really deep pain and all sorts of kind of ripple effects of issues. So these protocols are not just in place to protect the data or out of respect for SBI as caretakers of the data, but it's really fundamentally out of respect for the families. And so we're not opposed to folks publicly raising awareness on individual cases. As you'll see in this webinar in just a minute, we're going to talk about Kaysera's case. So it's not that you can't do that, but you need permission from the family or a relationship with the family. Because they've already been burnt by the system in the worst ways, and they've experienced horrific loss, and they don't need to be excluded in the decision-making on their loved one's case, and that includes who speaks for who. So that's a big part of what these data protocols are about. And if anybody has questions, I encourage folks to reach out to us. Or if you want to read this document for yourself, it is available on our website. You just click this purple box right there, and it'll pull the document up for you. I do want to also share that we have some existing data that's already publicly available. So we have our organizing toolkit, which I'll show you. If you go to the publications tab and go to reports, you'll see these boxes here. And we've got our Zuya Wiya Wichayo Niha is a report on MMIW across the Northern Plains, and with particular reference to the harmful impacts that the KXL pipeline will have. We have our MMIW G2 and MMIP organizing toolkit, which I'm going to show you in a second. And then in July, we released a report on MMIW in Northern California. And all three of these reports have maps, numbers, statistics, all sorts of useful information. But for the purposes of our discussion on southeastern Montana today, what I want to show you is in the organizing toolkit, we have numbers by state and by region for every state and province and region throughout the US and Canada. So this is free for download on our website. As you can see, it's 217 pages, so it's quite a large document. But the idea behind the toolkit was to empower folks on the ground who want to get involved in this movement to have the resources they need to get involved and to build an effective movement in their area. So it's not up to us to tell you this is how you do it. What we wanted to do was provide resources so that individual communities could figure out for themselves what they needed to do. And also, we know people have different entry points and interests. People have different capacities for what they're able to contribute to the movement. There's a space for everyone. There's an entry point for everyone. And that's what this toolkit is about. So what you see here is the data that we have for the Rocky Mountain region, which includes Montana. And this was published on May 5th this year. So this data is relatively new, although of course, unfortunately, it changes every day. This is what we published in May of this year. So this region, we have 305 cases total. The vast majority are from Montana with 237. And this is just women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. This is not all MMIP. We are working with families of missing and murdered men and boys in our work in southeastern Montana, but this toolkit was just looking at women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. So you can see we have some numbers here for Montana. If there's ever any other more detailed numbers that you need, just let us know. We are happy to pull that for you. And the data sharing protocols apply to the raw data, but if you're in need of just aggregate numbers like this, anybody has access to those at any time. So just reach out and we're happy to provide it. And if you go through here, this document, you'll see we have information on every region. The graphics are a little detailed, so sometimes it freezes as you scroll. But I think it's important to know this is available to you. The other really neat part of the toolkit is there's so many contributions from families themselves on how to work with families in a good way, how to empower families to take leadership. We have a whole chapter in this toolkit on data. So if you're interested in getting involved in data, there's a quiz on figuring out what kind of data you need. There's actually a template on how to gather data. We have, sorry, my internet is slow and it's not gonna let me scroll through this, but we have, we even have a full list of all of the places you can access data. So this data chapter, we have determining what data you need, a worksheet, how to gather data, how to care for your data, fact sheets, and then we have information in another chapter on missing persons databases in every state and province. So you can see this is a super long document. Here's those databases. So if you're interested, we've done all of the work to pull all these resources together. And then we also break down if they include unidentified remains and if they report missing persons to the federal database. And we've done that for every state and province. So there's all sorts of helpful resources in here. It's free to download. I would highly recommend checking it out. With that, I want to just ask Desi, is there anything in closing that you'd like to share before we give the updates on the Justice for Kaysera campaign?
No, I just want to encourage everyone to keep pushing for justice and to continue to understand that data is a core part of getting justice for our loved ones, and that we need to continue to treat data as sacred in this work. So Nyash, thank you.
Thank you, Desi. So we want to close by sharing this website with folks. This webinar is part of a series of events on Justice for Kaysera. Kaysera's family planned events starting from the day she went missing, the 1-year anniversary, all the way up to the 1-year anniversary of the day she was identified. And so this webinar is the event for today, but there's all sorts of stuff continuing. Pipestem Law has been working to support Kaysera's family, and they've really been just fierce advocates and great support. But they've got photos of Kaysera here, a press release with more information about all of the events that are happening now, and they've got a link to the Justice for Kaysera Facebook page. And then this is the whole schedule of all of the events that are happening up through September 11th. So we'll be holding another one of these webinars on the 10th. And you can see there's all sorts of stuff being planned. What I wanted to draw folks' attention to is the family is asking for the public's help. I know folks ask about how they can get involved. This is a great opportunity. There's links to advocacy letters here. We're asking the public to send letters to all of these agencies, asking them for justice for Kaysera, demanding justice for Kaysera. So you can click on them. For example, let's click on the Montana Attorney General, Tim Fox. So if you click on the letter, it will take you to the text, and all you have to do is insert your name. If there's any other information that you want to add to the letter of how you feel about it or anything like that, you can do that, and then sign your name on the bottom and email it to him. We're hoping that folks will do that and send letters to all of these agencies. This is something easy to do, even in quarantine and COVID. I think it could have a big impact if we had a lot of folks send those letters in. So please take the time to peruse this site. You can see it's at pipestemlaw.com/Kaysera Stops Pretty Places. You can also find it on the Justice for Kaysera Facebook page. And we'll post all this information on SBI's page today too. But please take a look at this site and get involved and support Kaysera's family. And then if you have an interest in getting involved in SBI's work or MMIP data, feel free to check out all the resources on our website and get in touch with us. We would love to work with you and to support. So with that, we're going to close this webinar out. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and be sure to tune in on the 10th as well. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
All right, we're no longer